Welcome to the Aztec Empire, a masterclass in how to make every neighbor hate you. The popular version of this story is simple. A handful of evil Spaniards show up and brutally crush the innocent, helpless Aztec Empire. The Spaniards were absolutely awful. This is not a conquistadors were misunderstood video. Relax, Internet. But there is one tiny problem with that story. It is mathematically ridiculous. Hernán Cortés landed with a few hundred men. The Aztecs had tens of thousands of warriors. If a few hundred sweaty Europeans conquered the Aztec Empire by themselves, the Aztecs would have been the most useless military power in recorded history. They were not. They were terrifyingly good. The truth is messier, more interesting, and considerably worse for the Aztecs' reputation. The Spanish did not conquer the Aztecs alone. Tens of thousands of indigenous people helped them do it, and they helped because the Aztecs kinda sucked. The Aztecs were genuinely extraordinary. Tenochtitlan, causeways, canals, chinampas, markets, temples. It was not a city, it was a statement. At its peak, it may have had around 200,000 people. That is a monster city. Spanish soldiers who saw it were stunned. And for once, they were not being dramatic. Aqueducts, markets, botanical gardens, palaces, urban planning that would make modern suburbs look like a crime scene. The Aztecs were not primitive. They were not stupid. They were not sitting around waiting to be conquered. They built one of the most powerful states in the Americas. And then they used that power like an imperial gym bro who discovered taxation and human sacrifice on the same afternoon. The Incas, meanwhile, ran an empire twice that size, with roads and llamas. Just saying. The empire was held together by conquest, tribute, and the understanding that annoying Tenochtitlan was a terrible idea. Conquered city-states owed tribute. The empire was a giant funnel, and Tenochtitlan was the mouth. And if you did not pay? The Aztecs had customer support. It was called an army. This is where the rose-colored glasses need to come off. The Aztecs were impressive. They were also very skilled at making people terrified of them. The dedication of the Templo Mayor, one of the most extraordinary pieces of imperial branding in history. Spanish sources may have exaggerated Aztec human sacrifice to justify the conquest. The Spanish had every incentive to say they had to conquer them. Very tragic. Anyway, here is the gold. They did not need to invent the horror story from scratch. The famous number is 8,400 sacrificed over 4 days. That is not a ceremony. That is a meat processing startup with religious branding. Fun fact: the Incas also had hungry gods. They mostly fed them corn. Lower estimates still put the figure in the thousands, which is already horrifying enough. This number was useful. The Aztecs wanted their neighbors to believe they were capable of something like that. Imagine inviting neighboring rulers to your capital and implying they could do this to your people. Dinner in Cusco reportedly ended with dessert. Not implications. That is not just religion. That is politics with a very sharp knife. The whole conquest starts looking less like a random tragedy and more like a PR strategy finally catching fire. Now we need to talk about the Flower Wars. Ritualized conflicts fought between the Aztecs and rival states, particularly Tlaxcala. Historians still debate the purpose. Training, politics, pressure, religion, drought management, all of the above. Capturing live prisoners mattered enormously. Bringing him home alive was where the real career progression happened. For the people on the receiving end, this was not a fun cultural exchange program. It meant living next to a superpower that looked at your sons and saw future offerings, which is why the next part matters. Meet the Tlaxcalans. Modern history has often called the Tlaxcalans traitors, the people who handed over the indigenous world to Cortés, which sounds damning until you ask one very basic question. There was no Mexico in 1519. There was no unified indigenous nation. There was no team jersey that said Mesoamerica United. The Tlaxcalans were an independent enemy state who had been fighting the Aztecs for generations. They were encircled, cut off from trade goods, repeatedly targeted by the Flower Wars. Their sons were being taken. When Cortés arrived, the Tlaxcalans did not see a foreign invader to be resisted for the sake of future national identity. They saw a heavily armed wildcard who despised their worst enemy. That is not treason. That is geopolitics. If your neighbor has been raiding you for generations and a suspicious man with horses and terrible facial hair offers to help, you might take the meeting. You are probably going to take the meeting. Calling that treason is like blaming the people who joined the resistance for the actions of the occupation. The Tlaxcalans were not betraying the Aztecs. They were trying to survive them. This changes the conquest story completely. Cortés did not arrive with some unstoppable European war machine. He arrived with what was essentially a heavily armed startup. His greatest weapon was not steel, not gunpowder, not horses. His greatest weapon was recognizing that the Aztec Empire was sitting on a mountain of resentment and handing out matches. The final march on Tenochtitlan was not Spaniards versus an empire. It was a coalition. Tlaxcalans, Hueyotzincas, Totonacs, Texcocans. Tens of thousands of people with their own reasons. They provided warriors, scouts, food, porters, intelligence, and the vast majority of the actual manpower. The Spanish did not simply conquer Mexico. They exploited a political catastrophe the Aztecs had spent decades constructing. The fall of Tenochtitlan was not only a European conquest, it was also an indigenous war against the Aztec Empire. Disease mattered, violence mattered, technology mattered, alliances mattered. History is not a Marvel movie with one cause. If your empire collapses because every neighbor joins the first stranger who shows up with a sword, maybe the neighbors were trying to tell you something. The llamas were unavailable for comment. So, did the Aztecs actually suck? Culturally? No. Artistically? No. Architecturally? Absolutely not. Tenochtitlan was magnificent. Their agriculture ingenious. Their military disciplined. Their world complex and fascinating. But geopolitically? Oh yes. They sucked. They built an empire despised enough that when the right enemy appeared, half the neighborhood helped kick the door in. That is the part people skip when they call the Tlaxcalans traitors. The Tlaxcalans fought the empire that had been targeting them for generations. Did they make a deal with a monster? Yes. Did that monster eventually betray and dominate them too? Also yes. Empires fall, especially when they spend their existence making enemies like it is a loyalty rewards program. The people who helped bring it down did not get freedom. They got a different empire. But justice for the Tlaxcalans means getting the story right. They were people caught between a brutal neighbor and a dangerous opportunity, and they made the only choice that made sense. As for the Aztecs, brilliant, terrifying, sophisticated, cruel. All four, simultaneously, without contradiction. The Incas would like a word. Several, actually. All of them about roads. They built one of the greatest cities on Earth. And they built the list of people willing to help destroy it. Maybe the real surprise is not that the Aztec Empire fell. Maybe the real surprise is that they convinced the modern world to feel sorry for them.